preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Jennifer Junta Hausler from the Charles Simon Center for Adult Life and Learning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Ruth and Oliver Stanton About Women lecture series. Tonight we're very fortunate to have with us Blanche Wiesen Cook, one of our country's most accomplished biographers and whose research on Eleanor Roosevelt has become a model that other biographers aspire to. Tonight she'll talk about the woman she spent 18 years studying, who has become our most famous and certainly our most interesting First Lady. After the program, she will be available to sign copies of Eleanor Roosevelt Volume 1, which covers the years 1884 through 1933, and Volume 2, which covers the pre-war White House years. A third volume, which will explore the war years and Mrs. Roosevelt's pivotal role in creating the Declaration of Human Rights, will appear in the near future. After receiving her doctorate at Johns Hopkins University, she taught briefly at the historically black Hampton Institute in Virginia, then for 3 years at Stern College of New York's Yeshiva University. In 1967, she came to John Jay and has taught history and women's studies there and at the Graduate Center of the City University ever since, and also occasionally in classrooms at Rikers Island. Her previous works include The Declassified Eisenhower, A Divided Legacy of Peace and Political Warfare, and Crystal Eastman on Women and Revolution. She's also a senior editor of the Garland Library of War and Peace. Please join me in welcoming Blanche Wiesen Cook.
Thank you. It's very dark, so I can't really see you, which is there any way to get it a little less dark in the audience? There, magic. That's wonderful. I'm really very moved to be here at the 92nd Street Y, this wonderful home of culture in New York, and to be here in the company of so many wonderful writers and biographers, women writers and biographers. And I have to say, you know, my talk was billed as Women in Biography, and I'm really going to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. But what I want to say about women in biography is, in all immodesty, I think that women biographers have changed our world. In the 1970s, we talked a lot about how the personal is the political. And what we did was to start writing books about women who led very important lives, and to take those lives very seriously, the personal and the political. And one of the things that astonished me when I first started working on Eleanor Roosevelt, and really the reason I began to work on Eleanor Roosevelt, because my field of origin is diplomatic history, literally foreign economic policy. And I wrote things about, well, like Eisenhower. When I finished my Eisenhower book, which took me 10 years, I wrote in my journal, I've now spent most of my vital youth with one dead general. And I started writing about Eleanor Roosevelt quite by accident, and it was all because there was a very mean-spirited book about her great friend Lorena Hickok, which described her as, you know, fat and ugly, and Eleanor Roosevelt was tall and ugly, and it was just this lookist and mean book. And I wrote a very mean review of this mean book. And so people started to say, why don't you write about Eleanor Roosevelt? And I said, why would I want to do that? I don't do that. I mean, I was a feminist, but still I was limited. I said, I do hard history. And everybody said, you know, you're really wrong and bad and retrograde, and go look at her papers. And I did. And one of the things that had really just not been dealt with was her amazing public life. Eleanor Roosevelt was a great activist from the 1920s on, and she started writing incredible essays that were all about diplomacy. Nicaragua, 1927, Do We Deserve the Hatred of the World? Her first entry in her FBI file, which is this incredible FBI file. John Edgar Hoover was obsessed with Eleanor Roosevelt. It begins in 1924 when Eleanor Roosevelt wanted to get the U.S. into the World Court, and that un-American body, which was a lifelong crusade. And when I realized how political she was, I thought, okay, I can do this. And so 18 years later, I'm still doing it. But it really is because the personal is the political, and for women, what a lot of folks haven't noticed was that the political is the personal. And I want to say that in these, and what I'd like to do is give a very, or a relatively short talk so that you can all ask questions and make comments, because this is a very controversial moment, and I'd really like to hear some folks, talk about some of the controversies of this moment. But for me, the one great legacy that's very abiding that Eleanor Roosevelt has given us is her often repeated observation that government exists for one purpose, which is to make life better for all people. And she wrote, but you can never depend on politicians to do anything about that. You have to organize. You have to go door to door, block by block, community by community, and organize and become part of a movement. And Eleanor Roosevelt was very proud to be part of many movements. In the beginning, the women's movement. She considered Jane Addams and Lillian Wald her mentors and her friends, and she brought them right into the White House. Florence Kelley, Carrie Chapman Catt, these were the people that she had relied on for years. And she was a member of the Women's Trade Union League, which existed to unionize all women workers. She was a member of the National Consumers League. And I'm very moved today when I hear young people say, we're going to boycott Nike, don't buy goods made by slave labor. That's what the National Consumers League stood for. And they campaigned to get labels put into clothing. And she was a member of an anti-racist movement. She was one of the first white women to notice segregation, lynching, race violence here, race violence, hatred, fascism there. And she brought people like Walter White and Mary McLeod Bethune right into the White House. And at this moment, when we are under such bitter attack in terms of this war against public education, and I have to say, in over 30 years teaching at the City University of New York, I'm a little astonished by this current war against public education. And Eleanor Roosevelt, one of my favorite speeches that Eleanor Roosevelt made, which is in the book, it's on page 196. I'm not going to read the whole speech, but it's my very favorite speech in the whole book at this moment because, we're in such an incredible moment. It's a speech that she made in May 1934. On the 8th of May 1934, there was a resolution passed. It was passed unanimously by the educators of America, the American Education Association. And I'm very partisan and proud that it was written by an historian. And this resolution used practically the same language that reappears in 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. And the resolution says that segregation is a terrible thing, and we, the educators of America, oppose segregation because it does a terrible thing to children. It encourages white children to think they're superior. It encourages black children to think they're inferior. And it destroys all hope for community. And when this passes unanimously, Eleanor Roosevelt strides onto the stage and gives this speech, which I will only read 2 paragraphs of. She says, I noticed in the papers this morning the figures given of the cost in certain states. Per capita, for the education of a colored child and a white child. And I could not help but think how stupid we are. And she used those exact words, how stupid we are. Since democracy depends above all on an educated citizenry, a literate, informed, concerned people, we should really bend our energies to giving to children the opportunity to develop their gifts to the utmost. To deny any part of a population the opportunities for more enjoyment in life, for higher aspirations, is a menace to the nation as a whole. There has been too much concentrating wealth, and even if it means that some of us have got to learn to be a little more unselfish, what we must realize is that it will benefit us all in the long run. We go ahead together, or we all go down together. May 1934. And so you can see at this moment when state by state, states are, just destroying their budgets for public education. We have lost literally $1 billion in monies for public education in this state, even though there's a tax surplus. And all over the country, we are resegregating. Well, this is an amazing moment. And just to be partisan a little bit, I teach cops, so I always say when I say controversial things, in my opinion, I say it quickly 3 times, because my students wear guns to class. So, in my opinion, this is an election with some very real policy choices. One of the things that I've contemplated about Eleanor Roosevelt is the origin of her journey to greatness, her voyage out beyond the confines of good wife and devoted mother. It involved determination and amazing courage. It also involved one of history's most unique partnerships. Franklin Delano Roosevelt admired his wife, appreciated her strengths, and depended on her integrity. They had different priorities, occasionally competing goals, and they often disagreed. Connected by trust, loyalty, and love, their partnership survived marital pain and affairs of the heart. They enjoyed different entertainments and preferred different people. They offered different advice to their adult children whose personal lives were frequently in turmoil. In the White House, they ran 2 distinct and separate courts. They were able to maintain a measure of privacy in their lives because a respectful press honored their privacy. Well, of course, this is a good place to pause. Simply to note that the level of privacy they had is truly unimaginable today. I'd like to give just 2 examples. For FDR, not one single photograph of FDR in a wheelchair or on crutches was published in the 12 years that he was president. He didn't want those photographs to be published, and they weren't. There's an amazing moment in my book for Eleanor Roosevelt when she and her great friend Lorena Hickok wanted to go out in California on a very private holiday. They were in a hotel in San Francisco, and they left the hotel en route to Yosemite National Park. And they noticed that the lobby was filled with reporters waiting for them to say something. And they did a mad dash out the back, and they begin a very exciting and scary chase that went up to about 80 miles an hour. And Eleanor Roosevelt, it's a chase that today reverberates with images of Princess Diana. And Eleanor Roosevelt, after going about 80 miles an hour, pulls over to the side of the road and says, "This is ridiculous. Let's go have breakfast at that diner over there, and you call your editors and publishers and go away." And they do call their editors and publishers, and they leave. And the most amazing thing for me is that not one of those journalists wrote a story about it. It's a big story. But that's a level of privacy that simply could not happen today. And so when one looks at the private life of Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one sees with new eyes today, one sees that they did not have a traditional, correct, or conventionally happy marriage, but it was one of Washington's most notably successful marriages. Fueled by power, they were each dedicated to making life better for all people. Together, they did more than either could have done alone. E.R. served her husband's interests and was his primary ambassador to neighborhood people, to poor and hardworking and hidden communities in the mountains and deltas of America. She brought folks who could not vote and until the New Deal did not count into the mainstream of American public life. On divisive issues, which he would have preferred to ignore, notably issues of race and racism, she was his conscience, proud to be, as she wrote occasionally, his hair shirt. She was the only First Lady, and she remains the only First Lady, to leap for her pen to disagree with her husband. And if you look at volume 2, you'll see this is a very interesting theme that runs through the book, and I'd like to, if you want to ask me questions about it later, there are several big issues. But from the very beginning, the very first act, called the Economy Act, which is the very first New Deal piece of legislation, which FDR said he wrote himself, and Eleanor Roosevelt called stupid and unnecessary. And she wrote an article calling it stupid and unnecessary. And it's the only article, let me tell you why, it resulted in the firing of all federally employed women married to federally employed men, including women married to servicemen in the Army and Navy and so on. And Eleanor Roosevelt was outraged. And she called for this act to be repealed until 1937, when it was repealed. And then she wrote another article saying this was a stupid and unnecessary act. And it's the only argument, public argument between them, which he actually demanded not equal time, but he demanded space in her magazine, the Women's Democratic News, to answer her. And she gave him a very small paragraph. From that first act through Social Security, which again, that's what I would like to come back to later, which she thought was a very stingy and wrong-headed thing in 1935. It just was segregated and barely enough, and I do want to come back to that, to all of his positions on international relations. And I have 2 chapters on this. One, there's a chapter called A Silence Beyond Repair, which I wrote really curled in agony, because it deals with all the information that came in to Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt about what was happening to Jews in Nazi Europe from 1933 to 1938. And this really unexplainable and resounding silence. And this is an issue on which Eleanor Roosevelt was silenced. And finally, she breaks her silence in 1938 in a very public, and then after that, consistent way. But she actually writes a book. She writes an entire book called This Troubled World, which is another chapter in the book, in my book. And This Troubled World, if you know what his policies are, is actually a point-by-point refutation of her husband's foreign policy from 1933 to 1938. I mean, just imagine writing a whole book to attack your husband's foreign policy. So it's quite a thrilling story, actually. Many people have asked me why I didn't limit my book. This is more amazing as a biographer. Why I didn't limit my book to Eleanor Roosevelt's wonderful public activities. Why did I have to bring in all of her private life and the intimate details of her life? And I want to say there's a very real reason for that. Not just because the personal is the political, but because Eleanor Roosevelt's politics, all of her politics, were fueled by love. And we know enough about love now to know that love is an experiential thing and not an abstraction. And it really mattered that Eleanor Roosevelt had love in her life. And so these are not just by the way realities. It's the core of her life, that there were people that she felt ardently about, and she felt ardently about all people. And this has a lot to do with how did Eleanor Roosevelt get that way? Well, one of the ways that she got that way is that her father, who she loved above all, was an alcoholic who died at the age of 34. And we all know alcoholics, and now they're 60 and 70 and 80. Imagine how much you have to drink to die at the age of 34. And imagine what that family life was like. Her mother died at the age of 29, officially of diphtheria, but she essentially turned her face to the wall. And Eleanor was 10 when her father died, 8 when her mother died. And really what she spent the rest of her life doing was trying to make things better for all people, for people in want, in need, in trouble, for people on the margin, for people like her family who she couldn't save. But that's what she wanted to do. And the other aspect of Eleanor Roosevelt's life, which again I'll come back to, is that she was very competitive. And there really is no way to understand Eleanor Roosevelt except to appreciate how competitive she was. I figured out this by accident, reading an article that she wrote, actually a book that she wrote, in 1961, when she was 76 years old. It's called You Learn by Living. And there's this most extraordinary sentence in this book in which she said, the happiest day of her life was the day that she made the first team at field hockey. And here it is, the end of her life, and I really puzzled over that. What did it mean? You know, yay, Title IX. But I felt it meant more than she loved sports, and she was passionate about sports. She was a team player. One discovers that she never went anywhere without her team, without her gang. And she loved the knockabout field of sports. The happiest day of her life was when she made the first team at field hockey away at school at Allenswood. And once I understood what this meant, she loved the knockabout field of sports. She hated to lose. Her sport of choice was politics. She always advised her friends, if you have to compromise, be sure to compromise up. And then if you transpose that to her intimate life, there's a level of competition. Everything falls into place. When Lorena Hickok suggests she give press conferences for women reporters only because they're the first fired and the last hired during the Great Depression, she agrees to do that and writes Hick, I've done it. I've given my first press conference and it was a success. And the best thing is I even beat Franklin. He's not holding his press conference for another week. And then she sets herself the task of earning as much as FDR earns as president. This is an amazing thing. $75,000 a year in 1933. You multiply by a factor of 10, you get a 1990s figure. It's a lot of money. And she does it. At the end of the year, she writes a friend, I've done it. I've earned as much as Franklin. And she did it in ways that are really unacceptable today. We would consider them tacky beyond belief. She took commercial sponsors for radio broadcasts where she was paid hundreds of dollars a minute from Selby shoes and Simmons mattresses, and wrote a friend that she was very sorry she had to turn down the cigarette sponsor because the cigarettes would have, you know, paid twice as much as the shoes, but FDR said that wasn't really a good thing. And she did it. She earned as much as Franklin, and she did so every year throughout their marriage, which is really, truly amazing. And then, for me, a key to his court, her court, is an article that she wrote in 1923. In 1920, well, let me go back a little bit. In 1917, Eleanor Roosevelt was crushed to learn that her husband was having an affair with her friend and social secretary, Lucy Mercer. And if you look at volume 1, you see I argue that they really recovered from that moment, and they worked very hard to recover from that moment. And then in 1920, he brought another person into their various homes, the Roosevelt hearths, all 3 of them, Missy LaHand. And Eleanor Roosevelt always treated Missy LaHand with respect and affection and generosity, much as she would a junior wife. However, in 1923, she wrote a very interesting article called The Women of Tibet, in which she wrote, "It has been brought to my attention that the women of Tibet have many husbands, which seems to me a very good thing, since so many husbands have so many wives." And it's in that spirit of competition, actually, that I see Eleanor Roosevelt's life. Eleanor Roosevelt was 48 when she entered the White House, and at first she looked about for role models and examples. And when she looked around at all of the 20th century first ladies who preceded her, the record was really grim. Every one of her predecessors sickened or died in the place. Washington was, and one might argue remains, a lethal town for wives with an odious history for women. And Eleanor Roosevelt set out to create another example. Surrounded by her own support network, she intended to survive the ordeal of first wifery. One of the chapters, this book, as I wrote it, came in very fat, over 2,000 pages, actually even more, almost 3,000 pages. And my primary editor, Claire Koss, and my partner is here. And we knew that it had to be cut. And the goal was to make sure that it didn't break anybody's clavicle if they read it in bed. And so a lot of the book was cut, almost 1,200 pages of the book was cut. And the chapter that is most on the cutting room floor is the chapter that I wrote on Henrietta Nesbitt, head housekeeper and White House scourge, because I became utterly obsessed with Henrietta Nesbitt and her little menus of horror. All of Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt's friends and allies learned to dine out before they were invited to eat in the White House. And this chapter really fascinated me because Eleanor Roosevelt retained Henrietta Nesbitt for 12 years. Bess Truman fired her within the first week. And if you want to know the details, you have to look at my book. It's very funny. I mean, but it was typical of Henrietta Nesbitt, who was really the White House scourge, as I said. And initially, Eleanor Roosevelt went everywhere with rambunctious dogs. They growled and snarled, barked and nipped, bolted and chased. Like her head housekeeper, who ruined the president's food on a regular basis and was rude and unkind, ER's dogs represented an unacknowledged part of her character. She rarely expressed anger directly, but when she grew cold, she could freeze the stoutest heart, and she never fired Henrietta Nesbitt. By the way, she only parted with her dogs after they had lunged at several children, bit at least one diplomat, one senator, and 2 friendly women reporters. And so I spent a lot of time contemplating this, since after all, Eleanor Roosevelt could have had the services of the best chefs and the best wine stewards in the United States, if not in the world. And I decided it was the one way she could get back at FDR on a regular and abiding basis. And I just want to tell you a little story, if I may. Once Claire and I were invited to the White House, and Hillary Rodham Clinton asked if it were true that Henrietta Nesbitt was a horror and served little menus of horror, and Eleanor Roosevelt served unpleasant food. And I said it was. And I explained to her my interpretation that this was one way to get back at FDR, who was, after all, a gourmet. And Eleanor Roosevelt was kind of indirect. And Hillary Rodham Clinton said, "Oh, I would never do that." So we can only assume Hillary Rodham Clinton has been more direct. I want to pause to say 2 things about Eleanor Roosevelt as First Lady. One, she did things that had never been done before, and on certain issues actually ran a parallel administration. And it fascinated me as a biographer that this orphan girl who never lived in a home of her own, who lived in her grandmother's house, and then away at school in England, and then in her mother-in-law's homes, which she hated. And I spend a little time really trying to understand the Schwiger from hell. And Sarah Delano Roosevelt is a very interesting person who changes amazingly over time and becomes actually one of Eleanor Roosevelt's great allies, especially on issues of race and racial justice. But as mother-in-law, she was very mean and rotten. And Eleanor Roosevelt never had a home of her own until she created one at Valkill. And then, amazingly, during the White House years, rents a 3-story walk-up from her great friend Esther Lape in Greenwich Village on 20 East 11th Street, and you can see this wonderful house, which has a plaque, Eleanor Roosevelt lived here. And it fascinated me that it was really affordable housing that Eleanor Roosevelt focused on. And she went really on a great crusade to create excellent, affordable housing and what we would today call sustainable community all over the United States. And I spend a lot of time on a chapter that I think is very important called Arthurdale. And Arthurdale was one of the New Deal's 57 model communities for homeless, out-of-work miners, destitute people in what today remains the Rust Belt. And Eleanor Roosevelt was told by Clarence Pickett, the head of the American Friends Service Committee, and Lorena Hickok, if you want to see the worst place in Depression America, come on down here to Preston County in West Virginia and see how these folks are living in caves and culverts, starving to death. A lot of them had been unionists, and they'd been blacklisted and out of work since the 1920s. Eleanor Roosevelt drove herself down and was appalled, and she determined to get those folks out of those caves and culverts by Christmas. And Arthurdale was created. And Claire and I went down there. Now, every historian and biographer and a lot of pundits have criticized Arthurdale and all these communities as a failure. But this was not a failure in any human sense. This was a great success in every human sense. And 83% of the original settlers live in Arthurdale. Their children and their grandchildren live there. Everyone works. Everyone's gone to college. It is an amazing community. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, I want these houses, every one of them, to be different. I want them planted in mountain laurel and rhododendron. And I want them to have the most modern conveniences. Indoor plumbing, running water, indoor toilets at a time when 80% of rural America didn't have those things. Electricity, refrigerators. And folks were appalled Even Harold Ickes, the daddy of the current Harold Ickes we know so well, wrote to FDR saying, "Do you know what your wife is doing down there? She's spending money like a drunken sailor. If Eleanor Roosevelt has her way, how are we going to tell the rich from the poor?" And the biggest issue seemed to be those indoor toilets. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, "Well, in matters of such simple dignity, we should not have to tell the rich from the poor." And they were built, and they were built the way she wanted them to be built. And I spend as much time as I do on Arthurdale and these communities because we have today 7 to 10 million homeless Americans in the United States. And no politician is talking about that. And I've been around this country in the last 2 years, and it just amazes me. A lot of folks say, well, most of those homeless people are psychotic and what we need is managed care. But if you go to some place like Northern California, and almost any southern town, what you see are intact families, mommy and daddy going to work, children going to school from their cars and vans. They don't need managed care. They need housing. They need affordable housing. And not one single federal dollar has been spent on new housing starts. I'm not talking about managed care or, refurbished old housing. I'm talking about new housing starts since Ronald Reagan. And so it's not an accident, in my opinion, that we have 7 to 10 million homeless Americans. And I get very angry at Jimmy Carter, who I love, and he says he doesn't want to take any federal money. But what we really need is something like Arthurdale, which is Habitat for Humanity with federal support. It really is what is, in my opinion, what is needed in America. And I'm waiting for some politicians to talk about this, along with other crises that we have now, like 30 million Americans don't know where their next meal is coming from. Do you hear anybody talking about that? Why aren't people talking about that? So these are great issues, and as I said, I spend time really talking about it. And I was very happy to know during the height of the sacred high holy days this year in September, that the religious leaders of the United States, all of them got together and decided that housing was a sacred right, R-I-G-H-T, a sacred right, and that the religious leaders of America, rabbis and priests and ministers and imams, would really go around and crusade for housing as a sacred right, quoting the biblical passage which are read in the synagogues worldwide on Yom Kippur, Isaiah 58, in which God speaks of ritual fasting. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? Eleanor Roosevelt took those words really seriously, and one of the things that kind of always stunned me is that she actually did bring homeless poor into her house. A lot of her friends were outraged because her grandchildren were also in the house, and they were worried that these are stories I tell in my book. And these are really, I love that the religious leaders of the U.S. have decided that housing is a sacred right. It really is a wonderful challenge to the entire community. And let me just say one more thing. As I did my research on this book, on some of these great issues, like Arthurdale, where each house is different and they're all built on 2 to 5 acres. And then there's a tremendous effort to get an affordable housing law passed. It's really Wagner, Robert Wagner, the great senator from New York, who was in leadership with Eleanor Roosevelt in creating some of the best laws of the New Deal. And at one point I called my friend Richard Lieberman up, and I said, Richard, it's not FDR, it's Wagner who is really pushing some of these things with Eleanor Roosevelt. And Richard Lieberman, who teaches at the City University and writing, I think, what's going to be the definitive biography of Wagner, said, I'm so glad you noticed, because what Eleanor Roosevelt would do would be she would come and sit and knit at the hearings that Wagner would have for his most controversial legislation, making her presence felt. The reporters would notice that Eleanor Roosevelt was at Wagner's hearing, and they worked really together on some of these things, most particularly affordable housing, which, as I argue, was her most significant issue. Ultimately, there was no group beyond her concern, no people outside her imagination, no category of outsiders designated for abandonment. For Eleanor Roosevelt, every life was sacred and worthy, to be improved by education, employment, health care, affordable housing. Her goal was simple, a life of dignity and decency for all. And after World War II, and out of the fire and misery of World War II, she forged, and arguably she is most important for forging the Declaration of Human Rights. And today, if you look at the Declaration of Human Rights, it really is a blueprint for the future. It really was intended to bring a new deal to the entire world. Of course, we have to go back and get a new deal once again for the citizens of the U.S. But this is what is on the agenda, and it's on the national and global agenda because of Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm going to stop here. I'd like to say a lot of words about the United Nations and the fact that the U.S. has more or less removed itself from the United Nations, which I think would break Eleanor Roosevelt's heart, removed itself from UNESCO and FAO, the Food Agricultural Organization, even removed itself from the World Health Organization and UNICEF. When the U.S. was going to remove itself from UNICEF in 1953, Eleanor Roosevelt went on a national campaign to make sure that we stayed in a leadership position because children all over the world were dying, and only UNICEF even began to deal with those issues. And so the bottom line for me as biographer is that Eleanor Roosevelt never turned her back on a conflict. She always said courage could be as contagious as fear, and she never stopped growing and changing in response to the challenges that were before her. Thank you very much. I hope there are questions and comments and thoughts. Yes?
I'd like you to elaborate on all politics is personal. I love that statement, and I'd love to hear how you, and I know I've heard it before, but I'd love to hear what that means to you.
Well, Kathy Brady, you're a great biographer. What does it mean to you? Thank you. But I'd like to know what it means to you.
Well, I know. That was interesting. Well, I'm Kathy Brady. My name is Kathy Brady. I am a biographer. I'm not actually a plant. None of you asked the question. I'm trying to make it stop. Everybody look good here. But I am intrigued by that, and I suppose it's who we are and our action in the world. There are many ways to our work, what we do in the world, is an expression, I suppose, of who we are as persons. And sometimes I wonder, it's a two-way street, and I really would like you to take over and say the attitude.
I'm sorry. Yes, you could.
And I'm funny, but I think the dynamic between the personal, who we are as individuals, and how the world works on us is very exciting. It's an exciting, and it's a question of biography. And then, so in the realm of action.
Well, I'll take it over. I was once on a panel with David McCulloch, and one of the things that David doesn't do, in my opinion, in his wonderful biography of Truman, is that he doesn't deal with really hard political controversies. And we were in Florida at that marvelous Key West extravaganza that they do every year, and somebody asked him why he didn't deal with the dropping of the bomb, which is a great historical controversy. Many historians have always believed there was no reason to drop the bomb. And I want to tell you, when I divided Eleanor Roosevelt's enormous FBI file into categories, her file goes on, I think I said maybe before, 3,000 pages. The largest single issue in her file is race. Everything she said against lynching, everything she said against segregation, everything she said on behalf of racial justice, all of her articles. I mean, this is obviously John Edgar Hoover thought this was really dangerous and un-American. The second largest entry category in her file is everything she said against nuclear weapons. And she was one of the founding members of sane nuclear policy. She was an active member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and so on. And like Eisenhower, who really, I mean, if you look at my Eisenhower book, you'll see that they removed Eisenhower from Europe within 20 minutes after VE Day, actually within a week. I don't mean 20 minutes, I'm exaggerating, because he wanted to denazify Europe. He wanted to denazify the German high command and the business establishment. And he was opposed to dropping the bomb anywhere, even in Asia. And this business of whether or not we had to drop the bomb is a very political issue. The very first thing that Truman said when he went on world radio after we dropped the bomb is that we gambled $2 billion and won. And David McCulloch doesn't deal with it as a controversy. And somebody asked him why not, and he said, well, he was trying to build character, a story of Truman's character. And I couldn't keep still, and I turned to him and I said, but David, I think that's a character issue. And that's what I mean by the personal is the political. I mean, what we do and what we say has something to do with the direction of our heart. And ultimately, Eleanor Roosevelt was a profoundly spiritual woman who felt this tremendous sense of responsibility and love for all people. And it's this sense of responsibility that goes beyond just there's nothing noblesse oblige about this. For example, I was really glad that when I was introduced, Jennifer mentioned that I taught in prison. Well, I've taught in many prisons, and I'm very proud of doing that. All over the country, people say, why do you do that? As if there's something wrong with doing that. Well, I think what's really wrong is that we have cut the Pell Grants, and we have cut prison education. And if you want to see something really terrible in America, see this wonderful, wonderful movie called The Last Graduation. And The Last Graduation was 5 years ago when New York State cut its Pell Grants, insisted that we're not going to teach prisoners any longer, and we've stopped prison education all over this country, and in this state and in this city, including the wonderful project that we had in Rikers. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt believed that prisons should be places for rehabilitation, not torture. And she went to prisons all the time. And every time she went to Alderson prison or any woman's prison, she would write very strange things to her friends about how she was moved by the women on the inside. And in one letter, she wrote a friend saying, I could have been any one of the women on the inside. And I really thought that was remarkable. And it's that level of identification, so that Eleanor Roosevelt really wanted to make things better for all people, had this great sense of what it would take to make things better for all people. Of course, it might also have been that she too could have killed her husband. But I think it's this level of identification, and that's what I mean by the personal is the political, yes. Thank you. Well, I started by saying it was really about her parents, her father, Elliot Roosevelt, and her mother, Anna Hall Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt was a very privileged woman. Her uncle was Theodore Roosevelt. And one of the things about Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, is that she really felt she owned this country. This was her country. And when she became a woman with power, she had a responsibility to use her power to make things better for this country. And there was this great sense of privilege and ownership. I think the two people in her life, in her early life, that, and I think this is what I emphasize in Volume 1 most clearly, is the great headmistress, Marie Souvestre, at Allenswood School, who really noticed Eleanor Roosevelt and encouraged her and saw her great talents and encouraged her to be competitive, encouraged her to be her personal best. When I talk about competition, a lot of people say, why do you talk about competition? That's such a terrible thing. But I don't mean competition, and Eleanor Roosevelt didn't mean competition, I win, you lose. It was her personal best. And Marie Souvestre really encouraged that. And encouraged, you know, she would rip up papers that were just parroting or gibberish, and encouraged everybody to think for themselves and to be different. Theodore Roosevelt, and this is the origin of Eleanor Roosevelt's great enmity with Alice Roosevelt Longworth, you know, that wonderful raconteur who always, she had a pillow that said, if you have something nasty to say about somebody, come sit by me. And she was very mean to Eleanor Roosevelt. And I think the origins of that meanness was that Theodore Roosevelt always said his favorite young person was Eleanor Roosevelt, because she had the political instincts. And she did, even as a child. But it really comes from, I believe, this need and desire to make things better for folks like her father and her mother, who were so embattled. And her great experience away at school. And then she was very lucky, I think. And some of us, I mean, I feel personally lucky to be in, you know, I said before, she never went anywhere without her gang. You know, I mean, I try not to go anywhere without my gang. This is a very dangerous world. And she was very aware that what she said was controversial. I must tell you, in the 1930s, I was very shocked when I went through the correspondence that she received. Every time Eleanor Roosevelt spoke at a Jewish temple or a black church, she received the most revolting hate mail from people who said, I'm a Democrat, and how dare you do this and this, and I'll never vote for your husband again if you continue to do this or this. And in language that we just don't use any longer. And whenever I'm in the South, or with people from the Deep South, they tell me stories about what their families used to say, these absolutely unrepeatable ditties about Eleanor Roosevelt. She was truly reviled and hated in a way that I think, again, is sort of unparalleled. And while we all know how Hillary Rodham Clinton is reviled and hated, I mean, if there were a competition between who was reviled and hated more, Eleanor would win, hands down. And she, you know, she always said it didn't bother her at all. Every woman in political life and public life needs to develop skin as tough as rhinoceros hide, and she never let the attacks on her get her down. And so I think it's this amazing combination of determination, competition, and a sense of entitlement. And I think love has got to be a very big factor. She was surrounded by people who adored her. She collected people that she adored. And she saw herself as part of a team, as part of a movement. She always said things like politics is not an isolated individualist adventure. You can't do it alone. You need to be part of a movement. And she was part of these great movements. Yes, in the back. In the very back. And then. Well, thank you very much for that question. Because people have been calling me all last week and this week. I've gotten the most extraordinary phone calls on my machine at school insisting that I have to write an article, especially on Hillary Rodham Clinton saying that she was for the death penalty. And a lot of folks are really outraged about that. And so the question is, was Eleanor Roosevelt for or against the death penalty? And the answer is she was against the death penalty. And Alida Black, who came up from Washington to see Claire Cass's play, and by the way, this is a very political time, and so I have no compunction but to say, Claire's beautiful play, Our Place in Time, has been utterly savaged by reviewers. Do not believe these nasty reviewers. It is a beautiful political play. 11 scenes from the 20th century. Every one of them will fill your heart. People laugh and cry and leave, full of conversation. But it's been totally savaged. And I think that part of the reason, Carol, it's a beautiful play. So I urge you all to go see it. It will be on until Sunday. It's at the Women's Theater, the Women's Production Theater Company on West 55th Street, right off 9th Avenue. And go see it. It's a great, wonderful, galvanizing, lyrical play. But I think these are incredibly mean-spirited times. And I think that it's kind of amazing. All women politicians in this mean-spirited moment have come out for the death penalty. It's almost like what a woman in politics has to do. She has to say, I'm tough, and I'm for the death penalty. And I think there's something really, in my opinion, unfortunate about that. And Alida Black, who came up, and I brought this with me, hoping somebody would ask just that question. Alida Black is a wonderful historian who's written 2 books on Eleanor Roosevelt. One is a beautiful collection of Eleanor Roosevelt's best essays. I was trying to get a guy named Frank Carlson, who's not here today, is he? I was trying to get him to publish everything Eleanor ever wrote, including all of her My Day columns, and he thought I was crazy. And what he did instead was to publish this wonderful selection of her best essays, which Alida Black edited, and then she did this very nice book called Casting Her Own Shadow, which is about Eleanor Roosevelt's impact on democratic politics. And she brought up this nice file of Eleanor Roosevelt on capital punishment. She's absolutely against the death penalty. It should be abolished, I have said many times, and I have these wonderful quotes. And in this file, I was very happy to see she also was appalled by the increase of prisons in the United States in the 1950s. And she compares the growth and explosion of prisoners and prisons for unnecessary reasons in the 1950s with what's going on in South Africa, the South Africa of apartheid. And I thought that was incredible given this explosion of the prison industrial complex today and this horrible imprisonment of young people, and as Jesse Jackson points out, mostly young people of color for, what my students call self-medication. You know, absolutely nonviolent, drug-involved situations for which folks don't need prison, they need help. And Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, would be truly appalled by this explosion of women in prison. The number of women in prison has gone up in the last 10 years by 300%. And in the state of California, where I just was a couple of months ago, I was told in the last 10 years they have built 800 prisons and 1 new college. So something terrible is going on. To answer your question, where is Hillary Rodham? I personally am very happy that Hillary Rodham Clinton is the first lady to say she wants to walk in Eleanor Roosevelt's shoes. I'm very encouraged by her courage to do that. If she really intends to walk in Eleanor Roosevelt's shoes, however, there's some very specific things that perhaps she might do. And one is to talk about the need in this town for affordable housing, the need in this state for affordable housing. She might also talk about this war against public education, which I know that's where her heart is. And if you look at her wonderful work with the Children's Council, what's it called? The Children's Defense Fund, you see that is where her heart is. And so when you compare her to our mayor, Rudy Giuliani, and you know that the very first thing he did was to cut literally $1 billion from public education, and he never restored it. He never restored it. So his war against public education is, you know, it's really, it's serious. So we have a real choice there. Is that Isa? Isa, hi. No, okay, you. To start reversing this investment and privatization of prisons? Well, I really think the very first thing we should do is end the Mandatory Sentencing Act, period. Just end it. It's over. And of course, I'm talking about the Rockefeller Law, which is a great crime. The Rockefeller Law today, in my opinion, and most of my students who are police officers agree with me, it makes a cop's life dangerous and difficult. So the mandatory sentencing law in New York has to be ended, and the mandatory sentencing law for the federal government, the federal law has to be ended. And I think that would stop this, you know, I mean, that's how they're filling the prisons. And then we have to realize what's going on with the privatization of prisons, how it's just this great big business. And if we started, I mean, where do we want to invest our money? Why don't we invest our money in education? Why don't we invest our money in health? Look, we're not in a depression. We have, the numbers are fantastic. Some people talk about $1 trillion tax surplus. But instead of investing that money where it's needed, where people are talking about tax cuts. Well, do you really know any rich people who really, really, really need a tax cut? I mean, excuse me. And so we have created, and this is unprecedented in the United States, we have created a disparity between rich and poor that is truly unique in our nation's history. In New York State, in New York City, just to take our city, we have a disparity between rich and poor equivalent to the disparity between rich and poor in Guatemala. And if you've ever been to Guatemala and you see how the rich finca owners live, and then you see how the latifundia survive, you know how really unacceptable that is, and what a prescription for disaster that is. And it's also a prescription for civil unrest and a future that can only be violent and terrible. So the first step is to deal with the needs of the people and use this money in this rich, greedy nation for all the purposes, like Eleanor Roosevelt said, to make things better for all people. Yes? Well, for me personally, I love teaching at John Jay. It's where I want to be whenever I've been offered other jobs. I've been offered many other jobs. I always go, and Claire and I always go together to see what it would be like to teach anywhere else. And I was very tempted. There was one year I was very tempted because I taught at UCLA for a year. And Claire, who's a playwright, they had a Claire Koss playwriting festival to seduce us both there. They offered to double my salary and give us a housing allowance. And if you know what housing costs are like in LA, you know how really tempting that might have been. And the one thing that I've missed by teaching at John Jay is having a lot of graduate students. Although now, frankly, I have a lot of graduate students. I like John Jay even better. But I teach police officers and FBI agents, and I've had a great time. For one example, I'll give you two examples. One of my favorite students, a man who goes around saying that I really shaped his career, is a man named John Timoney. And currently he is head of the police department in Philadelphia. When I was in Philadelphia on my book tour, I was invited to this very radical organization. It's an umbrella social work organization called Bread and Roses. And the Bread and Roses folks, you know, fund the Kensington welfare rights people. And there's this huge party for me. And I called up John Timoney and I said, why don't you come with me to Bread and Roses? And so John Timoney, you know, the new chief of police, he's no Rizzo, you know, and he thinks there should be a new trial for Mumia, which is very dangerous to say in Philadelphia. Gave a speech and everybody was really, really very happy. And I'm really, really very happy that I might have had some influence on someone like John Timoney. And in New York, the head of the prosecution for the Louima case is one of my students who didn't want to go to law school. He's the son of a single mother, a single black mother who's a policewoman, and who went to John Jay and told her son he had to go to John Jay to take my course. And he took 4 courses with me and got lots of scholarships to lots of law schools and didn't want to go because he didn't want to, you know, move away from his roots too far, and we pushed him to go. And his first job was with alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and his second job was with the Justice Department on the Louima case, and he was the chief, you know. And I use this as an example. This is a young man who needed a little remediation in math, and when I wanted to give a speech at one of the hearings where, you know, the mayor insists that we have to cut remediation, and I called, his name is Ken, I called Ken up and I said, can I use your name? You know, as somebody who needed a little math remediation. Then he gave it all back. He tutored in the SEEK program. I mean, he's a really very conscientious public citizen. And he told me I could use his name. His name is Ken Thompson. And I pointed out that if we had no remediation when Ken was a freshman, Ken wouldn't have gotten those violent cops, you know, convicted. And I have to say, if we didn't have math remediation when I was at Hunter, I wouldn't ever have gone to college either. And I just think it's an outrage to cut off opportunity, which we're doing now in the City University. I think it's total outrage. Yes. Well, that would make you unhappy. Thanks, Carol. I appreciate that question. You know, one of the things that really interested me, first of all, biographers, I think it's fair to say, never know what they really think until they write it. And I have to tell you, I haven't written the 3rd volume yet. And I'm writing it. And that's the period when I think she was really unhappy. And her niece, she had 3 wonderful nieces, one of whom, Diana Roosevelt Jakes, has recently died. And the 2 remaining nieces, these are the daughters of her brother Hall, who not unlike her father, was really a very troubled alcoholic who died terribly, and Eleanor Roosevelt was with him through his most terrible ordeals. And his daughters really have said what you just said, you know, that I don't talk enough about how unhappy she was and how depressed she was and so on. And I think, frankly, that came a little bit later. In the 1930s, all evidence that I have, well, certainly in the 1920s, when she's with Earl and Hick, she is not depressed. And if you look at those pictures, if you look at the pictures in Sue Williams', the radiant footage in Sue Williams' new documentary, these are moments when Eleanor Roosevelt really is radiant. There comes a time after FDR dies when, and I think this is a very big transition time, after FDR dies, Eleanor Roosevelt is out there all by herself, and a lot of things happen. One, she essentially becomes FDR. I mean, she really has a kind of almost character change, and becomes another kind of politician, a very aggressive politician. And I have some wonderful moments. Margaret Chase Smith, who wanted me to write her biography, showed me some footage of Eleanor Roosevelt and Margaret Chase Smith in 1956, when Margaret Chase Smith is supporting Eisenhower and Eleanor Roosevelt is supporting Stevenson, and they're the first two women to break, you know, this refusal to let women be on Meet the Press. And Eleanor Roosevelt starts to attack Eisenhower for being soft on communism and for being weak. And it's just an amazing moment. And you get a sense of Eleanor Roosevelt that you just don't see earlier. It's another level of combativeness. And then in this period, I think she's very lonely. Her best friends are no longer her best friends. Some of her friends die. And then Earl Miller moves to Florida, and Hick becomes a terrible, self-abusive alcoholic. And the only old friend who stays a really close friend is Bernard Baruch. And Eleanor Roosevelt writes after FDR's death to a friend, "Have you heard? Bernie has proposed marriage. Isn't that controlling?" And so I think that she went through periods of being depressed and also periods of being not well. And she hated to be not well. So I think that in the 50s and early 60s, when folks knew her as depressed, that's another phase of her life, which I will tell you more about when I write it. But her nieces think that that is a very key factor. And then you asked about her children. Let me just say one thing about her children. Excuse me? Anna was her greatest satisfaction. Her grandchildren. I think she was very close to her grandchildren. I think she was a much better grandmother, like many women who are in public life. She was a much better grandmother than she was a mother. But I think that her children were, all of them, disappointing to her for various reasons and at various times. And remember, it's Anna who arranges Lucy Mercer to be with FDR on the day that he dies. This is a great wrench between us. And Eleanor Roosevelt goes through a lot of moments of profound sadness and loss. And by the 50s, I mean, she has friends who are no longer her best friends. She's living, it is complicated. Anyway, that's another story. Some people have been very upset that I don't talk enough about her children in Volume 2, and my response to that is I spend about as much time on her children in Volume 2 as Eleanor Roosevelt did. But she spends more time. It's why she works to the end of her life. She's constantly bailing her kids out, and they're constantly in need. So I don't know all the answers to that yet, but I will, and we'll talk, and you'll tell me what I need to know, won't you? Okay. Yeah, she was viciously attacked for it. And it was always considered a failure by people who really wondered why we should invest money in Appalachia. You know, those aren't folks who vote. Those aren't folks who we need to worry about. The radical miners of Appalachia, we don't need to do that. So it was a public relations, it was difficult. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote many articles defending it, and there were many articles attacking it. Of course, in the 1930s, there was a very strong communist movement, and communists attacked it also as, you know, Hull House in the hills, because it was an experiment in community that they didn't approve of. So it was roundly attacked by conservatives and radicals. But Eleanor Roosevelt went there every year to the last year of her life, gave the graduation speech at every high school graduation, always supported it. It's really a fascinating story. The only time I felt really connected to the person Eleanor Roosevelt was, me personally, was when Claire and I went up. We really determined to follow her. We determined to follow, you know, a lot of her trips, and a lot of, you know, we went to Arthurdale, we went to the places that she had been. And one of the places that we really wanted to go was, there's a lake up at the top in the High Sierra called Lake Roosevelt, on the top of Yosemite National Park, 11,000 feet up. And everybody thought that lake was named after Theodore Roosevelt. And it turns out that it was named after Eleanor Roosevelt. And when I learned that, we really wanted to go there. And we tried to go by ourselves, because we go to Yosemite about every other year to hike. And we tried to go ourselves. The first time we were turned back by a lightning storm. The lightning was bouncing off our boots. And the second time we got much further in, and we realized it wasn't charted. We couldn't do it by ourselves. And then I called a wonderful woman named Betty Stone O'Neill, who is a naturalist and had written a beautiful book on the Tuolumne Meadows called, I don't know, it's not Paradise in the Sky, it's Meadow in the Sky. But it's a beautiful book, and she wrote a book about the man who went up with Eleanor Roosevelt, a naturalist and park ranger named Carl Sharsmith, and she wrote his biography. And I called her up out of the blue, and I said, you know, hello, I want to go to Lake Roosevelt. Can you help me? And she said, who is this? And she was reading my book. She was reading volume 1 when I called. And she said, oh, I'd love to go with you if you'd only called me 10 years ago. And but she arranged for us to meet people who went up with us, and the 4 of us went up. We went up with, it was a bipartisan trek, somebody named Victoria Hoover, who was a Hoover, and Ann Abbott. And the 4 of us went up, and it was very arduous. And I really got a great sense of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was very athletic and loved to do things and very competitive. And, you know, I got a sense of how mean she could be, because she always chided Hick for not being able to do this. Well, here with the 4 of us, we're in pretty good shape. And, you know, you couldn't really breathe up there anyway. And she chided Hick, who smoked 3 packs a day, for not having wind, you know, up there. Well, I mean, who does? So I really learned a lot, and felt very akin to her at that moment. And we all dove into the frigid lake, which we assumed she did. But otherwise, I didn't really have a personal, I just, you know, a great admiration for her, but not an identification. Yes, in the back.
Can you say a little bit about what your sense of the reaction of the country during your tour was to your portrayal of Eleanor and Jim in your second volume? And sort of maybe a little bit about tie into that when you're going down into the book at the time, and the letters and the Roosevelt family that follow that.
Let me say, That's a wonderful question. Let me say, Volume 1 was very attacked. And everywhere I went on my book tour after Volume 1, which was published in 1992, I got hate calls, really appalling and rude hate calls on every single talk show. And that didn't happen with Volume 2. And the person, it was Franklin Jinx Roosevelt, who wrote the letter in response to Maureen Dowd's review. And I called them up and I said, I thought you liked this book better, because they had told me they really liked this book. And Frank said, well, we did. We just didn't like how Maureen Dowd misquoted the quote, the northeast corner of your mouth upon my lips. She somehow misquoted. Anyway, it was a strange answer, but they really did like this book. And there are still family members who won't read the book. And I was seated at a very big Hofstra conference next to Nancy Roosevelt Ireland, who had attacked me when Volume 1 came out in the New York Times. And it was very unfortunate that we were seated together, and I offered to move. I said, should I move? And she said, no, you can sit here. And by the end of the dinner, which was very tense, I asked her if she'd ever read anything I'd written. She said, no, I wouldn't read your work. I wouldn't touch it. And she said whenever she sees my books in bookstores, she covers them over and moves them, hides them. And I said, you really owe it to your grandmother, who didn't believe in censorship, to at least look at these books and then decide what you think. And she said, well, maybe she would. And her daughter, who was about 12, I thought would maybe encourage her to do that. But except for these people who really, I don't know, in my opinion, are bigots and won't read the book, for Volume 2, I just didn't have that kind of reaction. And when I was in Kansas and Nebraska, I was on a radio show, which is a show called the Walt Brodeen Show. It was an hour-long show. And it was the week that Kansas had just decided they weren't going to teach evolution any longer. And I thought, okay, this is the place where I'll get a few hate calls. Because when I lived in Kansas working on Eisenhower, Walt Brodeen is the only progressive in the whole area. And he broadcast Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri. And I went in, he's 88 years old, and I shook his hand, and I said, I'm so happy to meet you. You're one of my broadcast heroes. And he said, oh, you and New Yorkers like you're all alike. You never heard my show. And I said, no, I did. I lived in Abilene for years, and you were, my hero. Anyway, then he hugged me, and then we were friends. But I didn't want to upset him. And he, for a half hour of the show, he didn't bring up any personal issue at all. It was just all politics. We had a marvelous time, and I didn't want to upset him, so I didn't bring anything up. But then what happened was phone calls started to come in. And the first phone call was a black airman who said that he was based in Hawaii in 1943, and terrible things went on there. And the man who was, I guess the company's trainer, really tortured these young recruits and caused them to jump off 30-foot platforms into very deep water with their full gear, backpacks, helmets, uniforms, and a lot of guys got hurt. And Eleanor Roosevelt stopped it. And I said, well, how did she stop it? And he said, I don't know, but she came, she saw what was going on, she left, and it never happened again. Isn't that a great story? And then the next call was from what sounded like a very 90-year-old white man. And he said, now what the hell is this I've been hearing about Eleanor Roosevelt being a lesbian? Where the hell do you think that came from? And I said, well, maybe it came from me. And I talked about Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, his court, her court. I told the story about the women of Tibet. And, I didn't quite say, I don't know if she was keeping score or making love, but, left it like that. And he said, well, now, isn't that really interesting? Thank you very much. And this is, the week after Kansas just votes not to teach evolution. So I really, that gave me pause, because I didn't, in Denver, and there's a sign up, you don't see it, but there's definitely a sign up in Denver, nobody enter here unless you wear 40 pounds of gold. The woman who picked me up, 40 pounds of gold. The woman who ran the TV show that interviewed me, I mean, everybody is so dressed up and so bejeweled in Denver. It was really very astonishing. And after the show that I did in Denver, the woman who interviewed me, who was very beautiful, and her many facelifts had made her face very tight. I'm not going to tell a joke, I just heard about that. But she was very beautiful and very incredibly dressed and bejeweled. And she said, I want to tell you something. If anybody says anything about what you've written about Lorena Hickok and all of that, just know they're jealous. Women live such stingy, cramped lives. And she's starting, and she's crying. I mean, tears are pouring down her face. And this was a very crisp and elegant woman. And so I asked the driver what that was all about. And she said, I have no idea. She's married to the richest physician in all of Denver. And so I think that a couple of things are going on here. One is that Eleanor Roosevelt's life, her determination to live a full life, is very important to a lot of women. And I think three other things have gone on between 1992 and the present. And one of them is Ellen DeGeneres. I think Ellen DeGeneres has brought into everybody's living room the very, this is moral and ordinary. There's nothing to be scared of here. And then I think Oprah. Everybody watches Oprah. And Oprah has made it clear to all Americans that a dysfunctional family is any family with more than one person. That is the daily message that Oprah brings to us. And everybody identifies with it and understands it, and that's it. And then I think the third factor, actually, in our history are the Clintons. The Clintons have made it very clear that folks survive their marital troubles, even when they are public and horrible. And, Hillary Rodham Clinton did it with a tremendous amount of dignity. And if you noticed, the American people didn't give a damn. And the Republicans were shamed. They were just shamed. This didn't move America. America knew better. Everybody has trouble at home. And so I think that that's been the great sea change between 1992 and today. Thank you for that question. Yes.
So if Eleanor Roosevelt were to walk in here today, I was just wondering if there's anything you would ask her that you just haven't been able to figure out about her. All the research that you've done, do you think you just know her so thoroughly that nothing would surprise you, or is there something that you would just go right over and say, please explain this to me?
Well, that's hard, and I have to say, I wrote the chapter, A Silence Beyond Repair, curled in agony. It really, for me, is not understandable. I don't understand it. And if you look at that chapter, with all the information coming in to Eleanor Roosevelt from her friends, with all the information coming in from Felix Frankfurter to FDR, and you know that FDR answers every paragraph in his former mentor's letters except paragraphs about what's going on in Hitler's Europe. It's such an impossible issue. While I was working on this book, I became obsessed with the idea that I had to write a book about the Allied response to the Holocaust, that I had to write about the Roosevelts and Churchill and how they responded. And then I discovered that I don't have to do that because Martin Gilbert did it. And one of the really interesting things, when you work on these people, Martin Gilbert is Winston Churchill's biographer. And after 6 volumes on Winston Churchill, he wrote 4 volumes on the Holocaust. And I'm very grateful to him because I don't have to do it, he did it. But I understand absolutely the impulse to stop everything and turn to that. How do you understand it? And so that would be, you know, a question. And Eleanor Roosevelt doesn't really get it, doesn't really change until very, very late. And then she keeps changing. But it's a very, that's the hardest, for me, that was the hardest thing to comprehend. And I don't know that I do. There are so many questions. The question Carol brought up about how unhappy she was. I don't know how unhappy she was. There are people, everybody says, you know, there's a Joe Lash who wrote, I guess, 6 books on Eleanor Roosevelt. And they're arguably not books about Eleanor Roosevelt, they're arguably books about Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. And the book about Eleanor Roosevelt after Franklin's death is called The Years Alone. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt never had any years alone. And those years that I would argue that they were not alone, they are nevertheless very lonely years, because they're years in which her great friends are not her primary friends. But everywhere I go, I find people who were there with her and for her who have, to date, not gotten any publicity, including a young man named William Turner Levy, who has just written a lovely book. And when I got the galleys for this book, I compared it to Tuesdays with Maury, because William Turner Levy was very important to Eleanor Roosevelt, a very young man who was an Episcopal priest by training. He taught at Baruch College for many years. He's now, at the age of 78, he's a president of a college in California. And he wrote this beautiful book on Eleanor Roosevelt's spirituality. And I never knew there was such a person in Eleanor Roosevelt's life, William Turner Levy, who was one of her great companions and escorts. And she had 2 or 3 of these regular escorts. And it really, that's wonderful to know that she wasn't totally dependent in the 50s on, you know, folks who were no longer really all that interested in her, or on people who, you know, who were too busy to be with her in any significant way. So things like that are constantly unfolding. Done. One more question. Yes. I would tell her to be bold, that if she stays in what James McGregor Burns has called dead center, she's going to lose, because Giuliani has dead center. He has the right and he has dead center. And if she doesn't move back to the old liberal position, which I think is, in my opinion, what we need in America, a liberal position which says that there's some responsibility the nation has for poor people, for affordable housing, for public education, for health care. You know, the U.S. is the only country, there used to be 2, South Africa and the U.S., without a national health care plan, but South Africa's had a revolution. So the U.S. today is the only industrial country without a national health care plan. And where are the leaders who are saying those things? And Eleanor Roosevelt campaigned for a national health care plan, which was supposed to be in the 1935 Social Security Act. And in fact, she said time for one more question. Let me give a big answer here. The Social Security Act of 1935 was supposed to have 4 components: national health care, housing security, work security, and it wasn't just supposed to be this welfare stuff. It was supposed to be something like the WPA, real jobs for real people doing real work with training, and a national program, and old age security. And the only thing that came out of it, after all the compromises, was old age security. Health security was dropped immediately. The AMA campaigned against it, and it was dropped. It didn't come up again until Eisenhower in 1957 did his health reinsurance plan. And he gave the pen that he signed that with to Esther Lape, Eleanor Roosevelt's great friend, who waved it in front of the reporters and said, "This represents just a puny little bone in the vertebrae of what I had in mind." And for job security, there was a compromise. It was WPA. But WPA was a temporary agency, and there's a wonderful new biography of Harry Hopkins by June Hopkins, his granddaughter, where she describes how, the fight to have real job security in Social Security Act of 1935 was compromised. And she really gives you the step-by-step of that. And Alice Kessler Harris is working on a big book on what went wrong with Social Security. And affordable housing, housing security was supposed to be part of it, and it wasn't. Now let me say one thing about old age security and all the other parts of Social Security. It came in segregated. And a lot of folks have not dealt with what that means. It's what gave us a two-tier situation. Welfare, which never worked, one could argue, or worked badly, and old age security. And why it came in segregated is that entire categories of workers were excluded. All farm workers were excluded. All domestic and social workers, domestic and service workers were excluded. All social workers were excluded. All teachers and nurses were excluded. All merchant marine were excluded, and all people who worked in small businesses of under 10 people were excluded. And if you pause to look at the categories of exclusion, you see right away that's about 90% of women in the workforce and about 80% of African Americans in the workforce, men and women. And it was a terrible thing, which Eleanor Roosevelt dealt with by going on a national tour criticizing the 1935 legislation and saying, this has got to be changed. It's got to be amended year by year until we get it right. And one could argue we've never gotten it right, and that's on the agenda for now. And so I would say to Hillary Rodham Clinton, it's time to get it right. This country is not in a depression. Let's get it right. Workfare is not right. It's folks in a neo-slave situation working at below the minimum wage. It's not right, in my opinion. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm told that I can sign books out there. There are volume 1s and volume 2, if you want.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.